Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
So Jason Upton, it's a pleasure having a chance to talk to you today, and I'm very excited to learn more about Kumye yoga and some of its clinical applications. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sure. So can you start off just by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background in psychotherapy and meditation?
Sure. I'm a psychotherapist. I started training in the mid-90s. My first training was as a dance movement therapist. So already in terms of my professional career, I had a tremendous interest in the body. And back in that time, the idea that you could work with the body therapeutically to benefit the mind and emotions was real left field. You know, it's very different from how things are now. Now there's a whole recognition of how the body comes into psychotherapy and so forth. So professionally, that was my starting point. And at the time, I was into everything to do with the body. I was running around doing workshops in body-mind centering and Bhutto. And for me, it was a huge exploration of kind of personal development and self-development with regards to the body. And then professionally, I went on to do a training in existential phenomenological approaches to therapy, which one aspect of that, which we'll probably talk more about as we go on, is a phenomenology through embodiment. So I really immersed myself in that and became quite I just took it more into my practices, and I did a lot of work in the field of trauma and abuse. Worked with sexual abuse, domestic violence, and also young sexual offenders. So it was always there in the room, and I got to see just how often talking therapies, they're very helpful, but often missed something. And because of my background in dance movement therapy, I always incorporated something to do with the body. You know, so ways of moving, ways of letting emotions out, ways of processing, ways of being present, and so forth. So I was always moving around with my clients right from the very beginning, even well before I'd kind of learnt something like Kumye. But on a kind of from a Buddhist perspective in terms of meditation practices, I started with Goenka practices, just kind of sitting there and following the body, following the breath, scanning the body, and so forth. And kind of very quickly progressed into Vajrayana Buddhism, and so forth. And that has really been my home ever since. But I suppose one of the things about Vajrayana Buddhism that really drew me was the embodied nature of it. I found myself, 20 years ago on a retreat, kind of, because my wife and I, we spent a lot of time in Asia, and found myself doing a 3-month Vajrasattva retreat, and it was fantastic. We were ringing bells and doing prostrations and mudras, and I was like, wow, it was such a wonderful way to practice through the body. And that just really kind of stood out for me, and the whole awareness of visualizing and sense perception and so forth was just felt a much more kind of integrated and enriching way to practice. So that's always stayed with me. It's always been part of my practice, even though I've kind of gone on to do my main root teacher is Dzogchen Rinpoche in the Dzogchen tradition. So he's my lama, if you like. But even in this tradition, there's many things to do with the body. Embodied practices. I mean, Kumye is one. Regent, maybe we talk about a little bit later, is another one. And the huge focus upon the kind of subtle channels and the whole kind of subtle physiology of this is just I find absolutely extraordinary. Not only conceptually, but to try to work with this in terms of a practice. So Yeah, and the kind of two of those, the professional and the personal, for me, then they don't go side by side. There's a real tremendous kind of overlap, which has been kind of very enriching. And I think the longer I practice, the kind of more openness I have to bring some of the things like Kumye just straight into my therapeutic work. Some clients seem to find it incredibly beneficial. So, yeah.
So, someone who's not that, even someone who is very familiar with meditation, I think, might have this question, well, isn't meditation all about your mind? Isn't that, are you really paying attention to your body when you meditate? I thought you're letting go of your body and going into this mental space. So before we go more deeply into talking about the practices you use, I wonder if you could explain, just for a very ordinary person who has this thought that meditation is about the mind, what does that mean to have embodied forms of meditation?
Yeah, Scott, that's it really is a really good question. And in fact, it's a question that comes up. I'm doing a PhD at the moment, kind of looking at the role of the role of the body in Dzogchen in the 10th to the 15th centuries. And one of the things that's standing out for me from my research is precisely that kind of difference, that kind of understanding. And it's really fascinating when you look at the history. You look at the historical development of Buddhism, starting with the early Nikaya, and the body is it's denigrated, it's, these defiled aggregates, you got to drop it. Nirvana is, with remainder, without remainder, it's when the body is gone, and so forth. So there's one way of looking at Buddhism where you have this tremendous evolution, of the purpose of meditation being transcendent in the beginning, being the purpose of meditation to be getting in touch with a kind of wisdom that is transcendent to the body, slowly working towards a recognition of wisdom being able to be present in the body. So even when you look at the Prajnaparamita Sutras, it still says Prajna is transcendent. You can't get enlightened through looking, through seeing. You can integrate emptiness and form and emptiness. But first and foremost, you have to realize transcendent wisdom. And that might come through observing, through noticing, through the usual kind of shamatha practice, followed by vipassana, where you get insight. Insight is emptiness, that's prajnaparamita, and so forth. And this is transcendent. And even when you look at the Tathagata Sutras and so forth, the Tathagata, the heart essence, is encased in these, this body and this form, and it's like a Buddha statue wrapped up in a kind of cloth or buried under the earth, and there's all these images that kind of give the impression at that time in Buddhist history that this precious thing called Buddha nature is somehow encased or enclosed in this defiled embodiment. And that's what really fascinates me when you start, you get the evolution of of Tantra, and my focus in particular is with the Dzogchen Tantras, 17 Tantras, the Dzogchen Tantras, because then you start to have descriptions of being able to recognize awareness, Rigpa, or Yeshi, primordial awareness, not as something transcendent, but by looking at the sky, by listening, and so forth. You can cut through conceptual mind in that moment, but actually with sense perception, because clarity, the clear nature of the mind, is nothing other than how you see, how you hear, how you feel. It's not that you have these over here, the 5 sensing aggregates, and then you have wisdom on the other side. But actually the qualities of this wisdom knowingness is present in and through the body. And they give a great articulation of how that is possible. So I really kind of see all this attitudes towards embodiment as being a wonderful evolution, the kind of history of Buddhism, to a point now where we can appreciate that from one aspect, yes, wisdom is transcendent, but you can open to it through the sensing body and the perceiving body, and so forth. And so all these different practices that involve movement, or looking into the sky, or using sense perception, are just another opportunity to have that moment of liberation or moment of awakening.
That's a great explanation. That's a really great explanation. There's no acceptance rather than denial of all aspects of ourselves, including our physicality.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so then to get into this practice that you use, I understand you use this practice called Kumye yoga, which I've heard a little bit about. I don't know that much about. They teach it down the street, actually, at a Nyingma center. But could you tell us a little bit about what this is and how you came to practice it?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's start with the words Kumye. Kum is one of the Tibetan words for body. It's not the everyday word for the body. That would be lu. It's an honorific word, more like kaya. Many people might be familiar with Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Amanakaya. So it has the sense of body, but also has a sense of embodiment and so forth. So it's a richer word. Mm-hmm. And Nye means to make soft or supple, to open. It has that quality. And when I was in Nepal, often you go around and I'd be saying to people, I'm interested in Kumye, or I practice Kumye. And many Tibetans will say, you mean massage? And that's the first thing that comes to their mind, because they think, Kumye, the body, you're soft, you're supple and open. And it's an expression that's often connected to massage and so forth. But even just understanding those words is very helpful, because the same process is taking place through movement. So through the movements, integrated with the breath and the different styles of movements and the different ways of practicing it, one is softening, opening, yielding one sense of embodiment, which for me is just a really, really lovely way of trying to encapsulate, or summarize the purpose of Kumye. But to go, to look at it a little bit more deeply, the tradition in the West that is most widely known is that of Tartang Tuklu. And he's practices in the Nyingma tradition, and Kumye is mostly associated in the Nyingma tradition. It's also in the Aro tradition, and a few others. I learned a different one from John Peacock here, who learned from different Nyingma lamas in India many years ago. And one thing to note is that there are different styles. Just as in Hatha Yoga, you have different styles. You might have Ashtanga Yoga, you might have Yin Yoga, you might have there's different approaches, and it's the same with Kumye. So when you look at Tartang Tulku's approach, he very much emphasizes balance, and the movements are soft, and it's still coordinated with the breath, but the breath would be done in a slower way. So there's this emphasis on being able to create a receptivity through embodiment, a kind of softening and opening up to the sensory nature of experience, the entire domain of experience that's taking place. So you could think of it in terms of meditation. So if you were thinking in terms of, he often talks about sense perception, just be present with what you're sensing, with what you're seeing. Well, in normal Dharma thought, we might think, you might grasp. There's this we grasp, don't we? Mm-hmm. We have like hunter eyes. We look out for things, and we're always doing it. Our eyes are flitting around, and what's that, and what's that? What am I looking for, and where's the bus stop, and so forth. And the grasping comes through, our sense perception. And so his cultivation of a practice would encourage just soften. Don't grasp. Don't resist. Just be present, just be open. And in the process, you create a sense of harmony, you create a balance, you create this lovely kind of responsive opening to it. So this is one flavor or one style of practicing. If you go over to the Aro tradition, the Aro tradition is very dynamic. I mean, the movements are very, very vigorous. If you just launched into it, and you weren't prepared in your body, you might actually tear something or kind of get hurt. You kind of have to prepare yourself. They're quite it's quite strenuous. And the difference there is that these movements are much more about creating interruptions in our habits. So we have our embodied habits that we go along. In Buddhism we talk about habits all the time, don't we? We talk about bakchak, we talk about latent tendencies, and we have habits in the body, and we have habits in the mind, and so forth. And so by doing a practice that might be more vigorous, you are kind of creating an interruption to the habits. And by doing that, that accords, very much with the Dzogchen approach of a practice called trekcha. And trekcha is to cut through. And the way it's traditionally taught is, what are you cutting through? You're cutting through the conceptual mind. And you cut through the conceptual mind in order to have this experience of Rigpa or Yeshe, which is primordially present. It's a lot easier to say than it is to do, but that's the nature of the practice. So if you do something that's vigorous along these lines, then there's an opportunity to do that. You can see that kind of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, has a practice of holding kind of Vajra pose like this. You push down with your shoulders and you clasp your hands above your head and your knees splay out and you're on the balls of your feet and your heels touch together. And even if you just try this for 10 seconds, it exhausts you because it's so unusual. And the idea is that you hold and hold and hold until you become so exhausted that you just relax and you collapse on the ground. And it's in that moment of collapse that perhaps you can cut through. And everything drops. The conceptual mind drops because the body literally drops on the ground. So it's trying to work with the body to support the fundamental principles of the meditation practice.
So I'm familiar with some of these types of practices, from a parallel tradition. One of the things I've heard from many of my teachers and also, Thich Nhat Hanh and others, is actually a warning to people who aren't mentally healthy, of some of those dangers of the sensitivity that meditation brings, right? Because, and in fact, I've heard numerous teachers of mine say, this is for the healthy-minded. If you have, psychological problems, then, be careful with the meditation. Now then, on the other hand, people like yourself and many others are finding successful ways to integrate meditation into trauma. So I would love to hear what made you realize that Kumye might be relevant for trauma, and also to have that conviction and faith that it was also safe to pursue.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the safety issue for me comes through my own experience. And I'll say a little bit in a moment, but that also includes my own experience of trauma and being really familiar. So I haven't just learned it as a technique, as a psychotherapy technique, and I've gone off and applied it, but it's something I know from the inside out. So I have a very strong experiential awareness of how the different movements or, how the different breath patterns kind of influence me personally. And that's, for me, that's an essential starting point. So when you work with a client, you already have a sense of which types of movements, which types of breathing might encourage an integration in terms of experience versus which types of movements or breathing that might create an interruption. And that's really, really different, So, one of the, I suppose, the key area for me in terms of recognizing the benefit for trauma was just my own experience.
Got it.
My wife and I were, funnily enough, in the midst of a 3 retreat in Nepal. But after 1 year, the earthquake struck. And we're in a small, very old house right up in the mountains, completely in the middle of nowhere, in the jungle. And half the house just fell down around us. And because we were so isolated, the door was always locked with a padlock. And it was a really big padlock, the kind that would swing back and forth. So, and the earthquake was enormous. Literally the ground went up and down by 1.5 meters and side to side.
Wow.
So it was crazy. It's even just thinking back now, it was, to say it was intense, it's just, doesn't even capture it, because the back part of the house went as flat as a pancake, and it was made out of stones which were, say, 1.5 feet long by 1 foot wide, and all these just collapsed towards us. And there was some, dust everywhere, and we were covered in dust, and we couldn't even stand, and so forth. And we were so lucky. We happened to be in the right part of the house at the right part of the time. And it took about a minute, but we got the door open and we got out. But of course, in a very traumatic situation like this, we suffered our own trauma response, the kind of very typical flee, fight, flight, kind of. We had the flight response. And it became really apparent afterwards that we had, post-traumatic stress symptoms. So you go into a room and you feel the panic, and you want to leave, and everything's okay, but you can't stop it, And really, one of the things that really kind of piqued my interest about this, especially with my own professional history, was noticing how my everyday meaning making through the body had been interrupted. And I'll give you a sense of what that means. So, for instance, I would hear a noise and I couldn't make it out. And I'd have to run around checking, and I'd ask my wife, "Did you put the kettle on?" "No, I didn't put the kettle on." "What's that noise? Is that another earthquake?" "It's not another earthquake, the ground's not moving." "Is it a plane?" And so, it's quite amazing how much meaning making we take for granted through the body ordinarily. Another one is I'd feel vibrations, and I didn't know the source of the vibration. I was like, is this my nervous system that's vibrating because I'm agitated? Or is the ground vibrating? And so this whole sense of inside, outside, what is the meaning of the very basics of sense perception became disrupted. And I recognized that really fed into the anxiety, the panic, and so forth. And so because we'd been on retreat, we kept on practicing. One of the practices that we did, every day was Kumye. And we were doing about 2 hours. And we were doing other practices as well. But it became really clear that the one practice which was helping us with the PTSD symptoms was the Kumye, and was helping by rediscovering that integration of meaning making in terms of sense perception, in terms of affect, in terms of knowingness through the body. And the more we practiced, the more I saw my experience change. And so eventually when we finished up everything we were doing there, I was naturally kind of curious to integrate this where possible into my work with clients who might have experienced trauma, and have done this more and more with obviously not with every client, but as you say, the thing for me is, when working with a client who's experienced trauma, is to understand how the nature of the trauma has affected them in and through the body. So I was clear what it did for me, so I need to know how it is for my client, because I had this powerful flight response and so forth, but other people might have the kind of fight response, or they might have other affect. Profound fear might come up, and it might influence their sense of embodiment. So you have to be able to understand the whole phenomenology of their experience, and have enough experience in terms of the practice to have a sense of, okay, if I'm going to encourage the client to maybe integrate some of the movements into our work therapeutically, well, I need to have confidence that I'm introducing the right types of movements. Because otherwise I might do a movement with a quick breath pattern that might just agitate and further disrupt their autonomic nervous system, and that's not going to help them at all. Whereas I need to be able to offer them a movement or a breath pattern that is more regulatory, offering up the kind of having that rebalance. And all this awareness is kind of broadly out there because of the wonderful research in neurobiology. So that's, I'm sure we'll cover more points.
So depending on the way a person is responding to trauma, you'll use different aspects of Kumye? Is that what you're saying? Or is it the same practice overall that's effective for however they're responding?
Yeah, sure. I don't approach it in a way. You see, someone like Bessel van der Kolk, his Body Keeps a Score, very famous, wonderful book, top-down, bottom-up approach, and so on. part of his bottom-up approach, one of them is yoga, and he's done his own research now, and so the way he integrates it is very much along the lines of how he conceptualizes it, top-down, bottom-up. So, and with the top-down approach, it's the recognition that, you've got disturbances in the cognitive schema. Mm-hmm. So how I understand it, maybe, through a memory and making sense of it, has been disrupted. So even though I recognize the traumatic event was in the past, I still haven't processed it, so I understand my situation now as if I'm still in danger or still in a threat. Yeah. And so you can work with that very cognitive kind of processing to begin to, if you like, overcome that disrupted cognitive schema. Bottom-up approach would just simply be, recognizing, that there might be disturbances in the body, the ANS, the vagus nerve, the kind of whole chemistry in the brain and so forth. And you work with this. And the way that some people work with it, and this is not particularly the way I do it, is you could have a talking therapy alongside and have your client say, well, do yoga, and then you're doing the yoga and you do a yoga class, and people who approach it like this, including Bessel van der Kolk, they do wonderful work and so forth. But that's treating the practice as a kind of whole, isn't it? You're saying, go and do the yoga class and so forth, and as a whole it will benefit you. Whereas my approach is kind of much more tailored. I'm more interested in where my client is at in terms of the difficulties they're experiencing, be it emotionally, how it's manifesting for them in their embodiment and so forth. And then kind of suggesting, I might say to my client, okay, how would you feel about trying one of these movements? And we do it together, And I very much encourage the client to check in with themselves, how they're feeling, what's going on inside their body, in terms of the affect, in terms of the whole experience. Then we do it together, and there's something about doing together. I get a lot of feedback from my clients. It's so different, Jason, when we do it together. There's something about the attunement, I think, of kind of two bodies, even strangely, even in lockdown, because all the sessions are taking place on Zoom. They say, even just seeing you and I hear your breath and we do it together, there's something about that regulatory nature of kind of two bodies being in sync and so forth. And so we'll do the movement and then we'll just stop and we'll check in. And I'll see how their interoceptive awareness is. Because I'm always very mindful that interoceptive awareness is the knowledge of what's going on for me in my felt sense in my body. So I could be aware of, the clouds outside or the cup on my table and so forth. That's my awareness going out into the world, isn't it? But when I bring my awareness into my body, one has to be very cautious, because often this can trigger, it can make people's trauma responses more difficult. So you already, as a starting point, have to get a sense of, is my client at a place where focusing on their body in this way, focusing internally, is too overwhelming for them? And if it is, then I'd choose a movement that would ground them, but take their awareness, like a mindful awareness, into the environment. Noticing what's around, having their vision open, noticing the sounds and so forth. And there's so much research that says this is very grounding, because it puts you in touch with your environment, it puts you in touch with the situation, reminds you that the trauma is in the past, it's not in the present, and so forth. So one has to get a very strong feel for that. And then if the client's ready, I take them into that interoceptive awareness. And there are movements that can encourage that. And so it's very bespoke, if you like. And really working with where the person is at in terms of their journey in recovery, and then having a good awareness of what movements or what breath work you could bring to it to really help them in that moment.
Yeah, so it does sound like it's very fine-tuned to the individual, and depending on who they are and where they are, you might focus more outwardly, and then find those right moments and methods to go inward. Right, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, for instance, if a client, there's a very simple movement where you just rotate the arm, kind of very slowly, and you make a full rotation around, and you do it on the other side, and you do both together, and it's so simple. But when you do this with mindfulness, and you encourage, just stay with the movement, stay with the movement, stay with the movement, stay with the movement, it's amazing how many of my clients say, I feel the panic at some point. I feel it's risky, Jason, it feels dangerous, and so forth. And I say, okay, so to what extent can we do the movement together where you can stay with the panic or stay with the risk and not be overwhelmed by it? Well, this is the extent to which I can do it. And then we find a way for them to do it. And in the process of doing, you can kind of already see what they're learning to do. They are learning to experience being in their body, and rather than pull back from the panic, but to open to it and to realize that I can be in my body and it doesn't overwhelm me. And it's not a place of danger. And then with that, you can explore other possibilities. A big thing in trauma work is agency through the body and intentionality. So in the example I gave from my own life, you're trapped inside a house, you can't get out. So the limits of your situation is meaning that your agency is thwarted. So you can't achieve it. And it's the same if you were mugged, someone walking down the street, you want to escape, but you can't, someone's overpowered you. So your intentionality to free yourself from that situation has been overwhelmed. Many authors in the field of trauma talk about that one of the most traumatizing part is that your effort to escape the trauma in the moment does not succeed. And a lot of trauma habits are about going over the trauma to flee, to flight, to escape, and so forth. So there can be a kind of replaying, not necessarily a reenacting, but it's not been fully achieved. A kind of habit has become frozen with the sense that in my body, I'm not able to perform that action that gets me out of the trauma situation. So in the body, and this is, I very much take this from Merleau-Ponty, one of the great philosophers who worked with phenomenology in the body, that our fundamental sense of intentionality and our capacity to perform our actions is already in the body. We don't tell ourselves, we tell ourselves what to do sometimes, but we don't tell ourselves, how to pick up the cup and have a drink. We just do it. Most of the actions in life, the knowingness is in the body. The intentionality is there. You walk into the kitchen, you go to make a cup of tea, you don't stop and think about everything, you just do it, And so one of the key things about trauma is that knowingness in the body just becomes interrupted because of the powerful and the dangerous and the confining and the limiting nature of the experience. So this for me is a key part of how through the body to get people back in touch with that sense of agency, of I can, express my intentionality to act in the world, and I can achieve the action of whatever that action is that I'm looking to do. And I can recognize, be it the fear, the panic, the anxiety, whatever, and I can tolerate it. And so it really gives a kind of very visceral opportunity to work with healing the trauma. And hopefully what I'm giving a sense of is that as you're working with the body in that way, you're also working with the subjective body, because at the same time you're working with emotion. At the same time you're working with will and agency and so forth. So that's why for me, if you approach yogic practices, Kumye practices and so forth, I don't necessarily see them as either top down or bottom up. I see them in top and bottom at the same time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, would it be, the way you describe this is very clear and profound. Would it be too simplistic to say that you're helping a person overcome trauma by introducing that sense of agency, just of movement, right? That's what you're saying, that a person can regain a sense of agency and control just by moving their arm and being aware of that. Is it that simple?
That's the start. That's the starting point.
Yeah.
And you find the parts of the body. So for instance, I've had clients say to me, in a moment of trauma, my legs turned to jelly. They failed me. Oh. There you have it. I couldn't run, I couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything, or I couldn't talk in that moment. My throat went tight and everything just went completely numb and so forth. And so you can find the parts of the body where a lot of the trauma is held. And just, bearing in mind everything I've said before, what's it like to come into that part of the body? What is it like, as you say, to reconnect with that sense of intentionality and to cultivate it and to, if you like, strengthen it a little bit? So there is this sense of, I can be grounded, there are Kumye movements that are standing and so forth. There's ones that involve balance, some are quite complex, and balance and so forth. And to develop that very kind of fluid responsiveness of, yes, my legs can not only hold my weight and can not only take me backwards and forwards and so forth, but they can be responsive to the world. They do have that vitality, that agency, and so forth. And to rediscover that, and so forth. And the lovely thing is that, as you say, it's all there in the body. We don't have to go out and recreate trauma situations or things like that. We can just kind of do this through the movement.
Oh, so in that way, then, it's almost safer in some ways than some of these other forms of therapies, because you're not necessarily even going back and reliving the situation, but you're more just trying to gain an immediate sense of agency in the here and now. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is important to say that often working with the body in this way, lots of trauma memories come up.
Yeah, they come up.
And there's always a space for that, working with the trauma memories. If trauma memories or flashbacks or impressions come up for me, holding a space that is safe, returning the client to a space of safety in the body. One of the first things I do is I always encourage clients to discover where in the body they do feel safe. There might be places where they don't feel safe, but I feel safe in my feet, or safe in my knees. I rub my knees. That's safe. So you create these kind of conditions. But I hold a space for all of those thoughts, feelings, impressions, sense impressions, memories, and so forth, and do obviously work with that and integrate that, and we speak about it, we talk about it, we recognize it where it's in the body, and so forth. So you do have this kind of way of making sense, way of processing that's not simply about the here and now of the body, but also holds that kind of larger perspective of what happened back then, how do I make sense of it, what is the narrative of my life as someone who is recovering from trauma, do I feel safe, do I make sense of it, because there's so much in the meaning making, why did this happen, the guilt or a sense of injustice or rage, and so that's all in there as well. And I'm also kind of I'm not against some clients have wanted to visualize the trauma scenario or tell the story in writing or paint things, so I open up to all of that in a kind of phenomenological way of kind of bringing it in, but I suppose the thing that I don't do is is ask them to reenact a trauma. If they want to talk to me about it, there's a space for that. But I don't jump in and say, oh, you've got to tell me about your trauma very early on. That, for me, that's, I'm just not comfortable working in that way. But and part of the real, kind of essence of whether or not the work is working in itself is the kind of person going out into their life experiences and kind of drawing upon what we do in an embodied way in the world, and then coming back and then saying, okay, I touch base with my sense of agency. I kind of stayed grounded. I opened to it. And I felt this. I felt the panic or whatever, but I opened to it and I noticed things change. So kind of coming back and having those conversations about integration is, for me, is also really important. But I suppose all that is understanding which stage the client is at in their kind of journey, if you like.
Yeah. You talked a lot about overcoming the freeze response and kind of disembodiment, but some people have the other response, the fight response, which maybe seems very embodied, right? Is there a different approach when someone is more on the fight versus flight spectrum?
Yeah, sure. I think they all have a different approach. Yes, I was talking about the freeze response. Not so much the freeze response, the flight response. The flight response. Yeah. The freeze response would be that sense of collapse, and I can't, and then getting in touch with that sense of the whole sense of agency and intentionality has completely gone, because I think of that as like, I once heard it kind of explained to me, which really made sense, of you can't fight your way out, you can't flee your way out. So, like animals often kind of use this, they then play dead, and hope that the predator kind of thinks, well, you're dead, I'm not going to eat you, So there's kind of something very primordial in it, isn't it? And in that dead kind of flop response, that freeze response, the kind of whole sense of intentionality and engagement. So that then is about kind of reconnecting with the very, very, very fundamental sense of intentionality, of being able to kind of get in touch with that. With the fight response, that's quite different, because often there's this sense of I've got to use my strength and my power, and it comes up so much that the world is such a threat that I need to tear it down, I need to break it through, and so forth. So for me, there's something about working with recognizing that the strength or the force of one's actions in the world can have an effect, obviously I'm not talking about the client kind of punching someone out, but it's a recognition that their basic sense of their actions do have a meaningful outcome, and so forth. And they don't have to kind of get caught in that cycle of breaking through, of overpowering, So I would work in the sense of, so coming back to, again, the very simple example of moving the arm, if I was working with someone in this way, they say, well, I have this huge kind of fight response, this huge energy that's going. And it's like fighting. I'm fighting gravity. I'm resisting. I'm forcing my arm. It's like I'm fighting with the world. And I draw attention to that. And I say, feel the amount of energy that you're pouring into resisting the gravity and your body. And can you notice that? Yes, I can notice that. What does it feel like? We go into the whole phenomenology of the experience. And then I would say, okay, can you notice in that experience, can you just notice how when you put your arm out in front of you, gravity pulls your arm down? And they say, well, no, I don't really notice that because my arm is so tense. You're not noticing the world, the gravity. So can you try to come in to noticing the gravity? Okay, and that takes time. And how much energy do you actually need to move your arm? Well, nowhere near as much as I was moving the arm before. Okay, so basically the import is you don't have to fight. Yeah? And so it is restoring a balance between, instead of having that strive, drive, that powerful surging energy of life's a threat and I've got to resist it, it's noticing that and realizing that the world around me doesn't have to be a threat, and I can open myself to feel it. Does it make sense? So in this instance, you're feeling gravity, and you don't have to be afraid of it, and you don't have to fight it, and you can let yourself feel it and let yourself realize that actually, if I open to it, I can just meet it with a certain level of energy, intentionality, agency, and it's okay. It's okay. And by doing that, you are restoring a balance between the person and the world. So, and what's lovely about the example I've given is that it kind of shows that you can take one movement, but with an appreciation of their trauma experience. The way in which you notice how they do the movement is a reflection of their trauma response. And the way you encourage them to engage with the movement is relevant for their trauma response.
I think I get it. So the way a person who has the fight response can benefit is that they're tightly in they are in their body, but it's like they're disconnected from what's outside of the body and applying too much effort without realizing that you actually need far less. And also there are other forces acting on you that you can take advantage of and channel, right? Is that something like what you're saying?
Yeah, that's certainly going in the right direction. It's getting in touch with, the world and not experiencing it as a threat that you have to fight against. So allow yourself to experience those sensations rather than this powerful drive. And when you notice the coming together of your body and the world, can you just notice that and then start to soften? Start to realize that, because it's through the movement that you can create a different embodied response. And that, of course, all this takes time. It takes awareness. It's not something that happens in one session. It's got to be, kind of built up. It's a journey.
Yeah, and you're somewhat unique because you have both the traditional psychological and this deep background with the Buddhist practices. Have you done clinical trials? Are there ways of training other therapists, or do you need the kind of unique expertise that you have in order to help people in this way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't done any clinical trials myself, and it's something that I have thought about for a long time. In my work at Regent's University, I did kind of start up a kind of Kumye group. This was mostly for the staff, actually, to kind of get their thoughts on how they might integrate these approaches into the work. But the whole impetus is to work towards having a pilot study with clients, and this probably be in a group context. So it's a bit different. What I've described is very individual, working with individual clients, and that's coming out of my own experience. So it would have to be adapted a little bit for working in a group, because you can't have that level of individualistic attention. And then just set up a very basic pilot research study. Think about the measurements that we might use. I'd always want to bring in something phenomenological, because you can have these kind of assessment measures, can't you? But I'm really interested in the kind of descriptive experience that might come from the clients, and then use that as the basis to see if we could look into any more research. But all that's on hold because of the current conditions,
of course,
pandemic and so forth. But yeah, that's definitely the intention, to take it in that. I've also got to squeeze it into really, really hectic schedule.
Yeah, clearly. Is there anything else you'd want to mention that we didn't touch on about Kumye and trauma?
Yeah, I think we talked a bit in the beginning, didn't we, about situating it within the the kind of meditation practices, didn't we?
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is obviously where they come from, and as someone who practices in the Dzogchen tradition and so forth, I see so many kind of affinities, with practices kind of like this, and I really do kind of think that, going back to one of the things that you said earlier, there is this discourse in Dharma about mind. It's really, really strong, isn't it? I mean, even in Dzogchen they say recognize the nature of mind, and so forth. And of course, one has to think a lot about exactly what's meant by that. But because I have done different practices and so forth, it's really clear for me how practices like this, and there's also other yogic practices, that kind of work with the subtle channels, and the Rushan practice that, is aimed to interrupt our kind of human embodiment and separate samsara and nirvana. And I suppose for myself, I recognize that there's this whole wealth of Tibetan practices there, which in my experience of being around, quite a lot of Dharma centers and different traditions, often feel really in the background for some reason. I'm not quite sure, So I suppose I'd like to see practices like Kumye and Chulukor and the outer body Rushan practices and so forth, maybe kind of come a little bit more into the foreground, because there's so much in the kind of West at the moment around embodiment. It's enormous, isn't it? All kind of research and so my sense is often there's this untapped wealth of Tibetan practices that of course some people are practicing them, there's no doubt about it, but I suppose I'd like to kind of see them kind of come a little bit more into the limelight and recognize their tremendous value.
Yeah, so we hear a lot about mindfulness, but it sounds like we could hear more about bodyfulness.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's a good example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of mindfulness,
Yeah.
and even mindfulness, I mean, often when mindfulness is taught, it's taught as a cognitive function.
Yeah.
It's taught as a cognitive function. You're mindful of something as an object. You're mindful of the body, you're mindful of breath. So it's a little bit shot through with this kind of early Indian philosophy and so forth that could be read in a little bit dualistic way, and so for me it's like it's in the body, we can be mindful in and through the body, and just have that awareness, and so forth.
That's wonderful. Right, to wrap up, it actually reminds me of this joke Robert Thurman told once, because he was making fun a little bit of some of his academic colleagues, but he said, a lot of my colleagues, they think your body is just something that brings your brain from conference room to conference room for intellectual discussions, So I think, this conversation has, I've really enjoyed it. I wish I could talk to you for hours, actually, but I think the people listening to the podcast are really going to benefit a lot, and I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing in the world, and it's a lot of work. It seems like a lot of work and a lot of creativity and experimentation in a very sensitive area that's bearing fruit. So congratulations on making so much meaning and benefit out of your life.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just lovely to be on this journey, and to integrate all these different aspects of my life. To be really honest, it feels like a blessing.
Yeah, it's nice you can combine your spiritual practice and your professional practice in such an effective way.